What's up, nerds? How y'all doing?
But hey, I'm chalked up. I'm ready to go, baby. So again, in this debate with Matt, it's not wrong to give evidence, excuse me. But if the debate is about belief in the resurrection as reasonable, then the real debate is about the prior question of reason and the criteria of reason, which he started with that, but now he's gone into, well, let's act like we all have the same criteria of proof and rationality when the atheist worldview is completely, ultimately irrational. And then let's, on those grounds, act as if I'm not debating an atheist, but I'm debating a person with the same criteria as me. But he'd asked at the beginning what Matt's criteria is. And I like that he's critiquing Matt's inconsistency on historical claims, but the reason that this debate is not going to go anywhere ultimately is because he's not challenging Matt's presuppositions of autonomy and atheism itself in terms of worldviews, as if just believing in the resurrection is somehow like a theory neutral fact. Again, Matt can accept the resurrection and reject Christianity. Right. And that's the whole assumption of the piecemeal foundationalist approach, is that, oh, well, if I just, come up with a few of these basic ideas, then maybe it'll be likely probable for Matt to accept Christianity. But I mean, why does he have to accept Christianity merely because he accepts some person resurrecting or rising from the dead? There was a great point Bonson always used to say about this, which is that, couldn't the atheist just say, well, crazy things happen? But why does crazy things happening entail that I should accept Christianity?
1, the claims never happened and were invented by later Christians as a legendary development. The problem with this explanation is that we have Paul's writings, and he had contact with the disciples and even makes this claim about himself. We also have accounts from Luke, who shows himself to be a very reliable historian.
Father Deacon makes a great point in his paper, which is that if I'm going to grant that the atheist has the correct criteria of reason and the correct epistemology to investigate and evaluate evidences from the outset, then couldn't the atheist turn around and, point out that foundationalist approaches to these questions, they just ignore the questions that we ask.
He both documents these appearances and Peter's testimony about the resurrection in Acts 2. Finally, if the disciples never claimed Jesus rose from the dead, then we have no explanation for how church communities based on this belief arose so quickly when other messianic movements fell apart after the death of their leaders. This is why scholars universally agree that an authentic experience motivated the disciples to make these claims. The agnostic New Testament scholar Paula Fredrickson says, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historical evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know that as a historian that they must have seen something. Similarly, the atheistic historian Richard Carrier says, I think it more probable that Peter and James, and certainly Paul, maybe several others, saw something that inspired their faith. I think it most likely that others had these visions earlier than Paul, and that Paul's letters give more or less a correct version of his own experiences, such as his persecution of the early believers. The disciples, maybe they just made the resurrection claims, they made the claims, but they were lying. But this doesn't really explain the involvement of outsiders like Paul and James, who had no reason to lie, or the evidence of the disciples' sincerity and their willingness to be persecuted. Maybe the disciples sincerely believed they saw the risen Jesus, but they were mistaken. They had some kind of grief-induced hallucination. But this doesn't explain many other facts related to Jesus' death. 1, we should be skeptical of the disciples being grief-stricken. It's equally likely they were angry they wasted.
Yeah, but again, even if you do demonstrate that, why should I, on this piecemeal approach, if this is the approach that we should take, then shouldn't you piecemeal convince me of every doctrine of Christianity? If it's a piecemeal approach, then you're going to be bound then to give me piecemeal evidence of every single doctrine within Christianity. Unless you would just argue for the paradigm as a whole. Wouldn't that make much more sense? The atheist does not have the competent, correct criteria of evidence. In fact, he can't give an account of evidence at all, much less reasoning, much less proofs, much less logic, all of which are prior to the actual doing of evidential analysis. I mean, why can these people not get this, right? There's questions that are prior to logic and argumentation and evaluation of evidences, namely epistemological questions, right? If you're going to make metaphysical assumptions about what exists, the nature of that evidence, how it relates to other evidences, formulating theories, etc., that's all interpretations of things in the domain of, what exists, metaphysical realities, that you're just assuming, right? But you haven't demonstrated on foundationalist grounds the metaphysical principles and truths that are being used in the evaluation of evidence and that are assumed in this evidence. You haven't demonstrated the logical principles, the epistemological principles that are prior to the metaphysics. You're just assuming that that's the case. And yeah, you could say, well, but Matt's assuming the same thing too, so aren't we on the same page? No, we're not, because just because you're doing that doesn't mean that you have the same good reasons to do that. That's what justification is about. That's what the whole point of why we don't want to grant that the atheist has the ability to give coherent, justified, meaningful interpretations of the evidence. It's giving him too much.
Years of their life following another failed Messiah. Moreover, Paul and James were not grief-stricken over Jesus' death because they weren't believers when he was crucified. 2, since ancient Jews believed the resurrection wouldn't take place until the end of the world, it follows that even if they had grief-induced hallucinations, the disciples would have thought they saw Jesus' soul in heaven, not his glorified body on earth. Moreover, given their fierce monotheism, we would expect them to hallucinate Jesus as a man exalted in heaven, and not as the creator.
I'm going to take issue with the notion of fierce monotheism. Again, the New Testament doesn't use, and there's no usage of the term monotheism, as Dr. Branson has shown, anywhere in this period. That's a much later term. Monotheism isn't really there. If you read the Cappadocians, it's the monarchia of the Father, right? And the Nicene Creed's definition of we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. So the identification of the one God begins with the person of the Father in the Creed. So it is actually not the case that the apostles and the Jews believed in and defended a radical monotheism. That's a myth. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as an Old Testament Unitarianism that gives way to Trinitarian theology in the New Testament. And this is fundamental to our system and to our theology. Orthodox theology is always insistent that the God of the Old Testament is the Trinity just as much as the God of the New Testament is the Trinity, you see. So fundamentally weird mistake on the part of Trent there, but I think that's just because Trent's in the system of Roman Catholicism and is probably in large degree a Thomist. Maybe he takes issue with some of Thomas's teachings, I don't know, but the Thomist doctrine of simplicity usually lends to people arguing that the Old Testament doctrine of the Unitarian monotheism was just kind of a given, right? Abraham believed in a generic unity, a generic Unitarian God, which is precisely what Muslims argue. No. In fact, the Old Testament doctrine is the Trinity. When the Church Fathers in the New Testament, in the post-apostolic period, Justin Martyr, when they prove the Trinity, when Irenaeus proves the Trinity, when the New Testament writers prove their Trinity doctrine, even though they don't use the word Trinity, they go to the Old Testament. They go to the Old Testament. That's the number one starting point for proving the Trinity. When we argue with the Muslims, where do we prove the Trinity? The Old Testament, which we couldn't do if the Old Testament taught a bare Unitarian radical monotheism. So that's just false.
Himself, unless.
But again, Roman Catholics don't have the Trinity. They're heterodox on the Trinity. And I'm not saying that to insult Trent. I don't have any ill will or call into question, Trent's motives at all. just factually speaking, the Orthodox position is that the Roman Catholics do not have the correct Trinitarian doctrine.
Jesus told them he used divine power to raise himself from the dead. 3, Paul tells us Jesus appeared to groups of people, and the closest thing we have to group hallucinations or mass hysteria usually involve people psychosomatically experiencing a similar illness, not individuals claiming to all see the same thing that doesn't exist, especially something that didn't conform to their previous expectations. 4, the New Testament authors repeatedly make it clear when someone has a dream, a vision, where they think they've seen a ghost or a spirit. The resurrection appearances in the New Testament all point toward groups of people seeing an embodied, recently deceased individual that would not be the subject of an hallucination. 5, since the resurrection was preached in Jerusalem within a few weeks of the crucifixion, the disciples, or enemies of the faith, could have checked Jesus' tomb to see if they were hallucinating. And the evidence suggests they...
You know, all of these kinds of arguments, the reason that they're, I just don't think they're very good, they're not very convincing, is because, again, they all rest on assumptions that aren't being questioned, that aren't going to solve any of these disputes. It's like, well, if this, then it seems like this could have been the case, or it seems like they would have done this, and maybe they could have done that. It's all this like really hypothetical stuff that is really indeterminate, right? And it's only reasonable to accept Trent's conclusions on Trent's theory and criteria of reasoning, right? On Trent's epistemology. And so I don't think Trent gets the point that you and Matt have radically different accounts of reasoning, evidence, and epistemology. I mean, I'm speaking to Trent the Christian here, not Trent the philosopher. Trent the Christian should agree with me that Matt and he have a completely different account and justification for the criteria of justification. So again, all of this is just like, let's tell stories about what could have happened or might have happened, and let's see in the scales, like which one's more reasonable and less reasonable. I mean, it's just arbitrary, right? More reasonable on whose criteria or theory of reasoning, which is what Trent first asked Matt. But now he's acting like, I mean, this line of argumentation is as if Matt has the correct line of argumentation and reasoning. But he had first asked Matt. Matt needs to give a standard of what's reasonable. But now the line of argument is acting as if they have the same standards. So I just find these types of arguments, which there might be situations where you would need to say something like, it's more reasonable to believe this, you know, in some niche dispute about false visions of the apostles, or, you know, they hallucinated the resurrection. And but really, again, this is all just ignoring the more fundamental questions that neither of these parties in the debate seem to be grasping.
Divinity raises the humanity of Christ through theosis, and that's exactly what we experience.